What if I told you that the real reason you feel drained, scattered, and anxious isn't because you're lazy or broken, but because you've been explaining yourself to people who were never meant to understand you? You've been handing out pieces of your peace in conversations that leave you emptier than before. You've been caught in the noise, and in a world addicted to validation, where everyone's talking, scrolling, proving. There's one ancient truth that has quietly endured for thousands of years, one that every Zen master, every awakened being has whispered through the ages. Silence is power, not the silence of suppression or defeat, but the silence that stands tall, the silence that listens without needing to respond, the silence that doesn't react because it has already seen beyond. You see, we've been taught to measure success by noise. How loud we are, how visible, how constant. But what if your greatest transformation was waiting on the other side of stillness? What if, when you finally stop talking, you actually start hearing yourself? In Buddhism, silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of understanding. It's the sacred space where awareness meets clarity, where ego loosens its grip and the soul exhales. Because here's the truth we often forget. You don't need to explain yourself to be valid. You don't need to defend your choices to be worthy. You don't need to prove your point to hold your place in the world. In fact, the moment you let go of the need to be understood is the moment you become free. I want you to really hear this. You're not falling behind. You're not missing out. You're just being pulled into noise that isn't yours. The distractions, the comparisons, the arguments you replay at night in your mind, all of it noise. And noise is the enemy of clarity. Think about it. When was the last time you sat with yourself? Really sat, without reaching for your phone, without explaining yourself in your head, without trying to fix anything? When was the last time you simply allowed yourself to be? We fear silence because it feels like emptiness, but it's not. Silence is full of truth, of potential, of presence. And in that space, when the external world quiets, you start to remember something ancient inside you. You start to remember that you're not here to win arguments. You're not here to convince anyone. You're not even here to perform. You're here to be, to breathe, to align, to come home to yourself. And make no mistake, this isn't easy. Staying silent in a reactive world requires more strength than shouting ever will. But this silence is your sanctuary. And the moment you claim it, you begin to build a different kind of life. One that doesn't crumble under pressure, because its foundation is rooted within. Buddhism has a name for this state: equanimity, the unshakable mind, the still lake that reflects without distortion. You don't get there by adding more to your plate. You get there by subtracting everything that doesn't serve, by letting go of the urge to speak just to be heard, by releasing the need to win every mental debate, by choosing peace over performance. Because the truth is, you don't need more noise. You need more alignment. You don't need more validation. You need more presence. You don't need to be louder. You need to be clearer inside. So if you're exhausted, if your soul feels cluttered, if you're constantly trying to keep up with a world that never stops talking, this is your invitation to stop, to breathe, to return. Because when you focus on yourself and stay silent, everything begins to fall into place. Not because the world changes, but because you do. You start showing up differently. You start listening deeper. You start acting from intention, not impulse. And without needing to prove anything, you become undeniable. You become that presence people feel, but can't quite explain. The room grows quieter when you walk in, not because you're loud, but because you're grounded. You speak less, and yet your energy says more. You react less, and yet your presence shifts everything. You do less, and yet somehow You create more. This isn't magic, it's mastery, and the path begins here, in silence, in stillness, in self-focus, not in running faster, but in walking inward. Because once you turn inward, everything outside starts making sense. Now take a breath. Let the world pause with you. Let the noise fall away. You're not lost, you're just finally coming home. There's a line in Buddhist teachings that feels more like a lifeline. Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. At first glance, it sounds simple, almost too simple. But sit with it long enough. Let it breathe into your bones. And you'll realize it's not a phrase, it's a direction, a compass, a path home. Because here's the truth, most of us are living from the outside in. We react, we chase, we compare. We let other people's expectations define our actions. We let the opinions of strangers become the architects of our self-worth. And over time, we forget who we are underneath all of it. We become like a house built on sand, pretty on the surface, but one strong wave of judgment or failure, and everything trembles. But Buddhism offers something radically different. Come back to your breath, back to your body, back to your center. Because in that stillness, beneath the noise, beneath the storm, you'll find a place that cannot be shaken. Imagine for a moment that your true self is the sun, radiant, steady, constant. But in daily life, clouds come. Criticism, distraction, anxiety, fear. Storms pass through. Heartbreak, failure, conflict. And you forget that you're the sun. You start thinking you're the storm. But the sun never disappears, it's just obscured. That's what returning to your center really means. Not becoming something new, but remembering what has always been there. Beneath the clouds of thinking, reacting, explaining. It's the practice of living from the inside out. In Zen tradition, this is cultivated through zazen, seated meditation, not to escape life, but to learn how to sit with it. You sit with the breath, with the body, with the thoughts. You don't chase them, you don't push them away, you just observe. And in that quiet observing, something amazing happens. You begin to recognize the space between the thoughts, the stillness beneath the emotion, the silence beneath the noise. And in that space, clarity returns, like watching mud settle in water. What was once murky becomes transparent. A story from the monastery. There was once a young monk who constantly felt overwhelmed. Too many chores, too many expectations, too many voices. He went to the old Zen master and said, "Master, I'm trying so hard, but I feel like I'm always falling behind." The master simply poured a cup of tea and kept pouring. The tea spilled over the edges and soaked the table. "Master." The monk said, "It's full, stop." The old master smiled, "And so is your mind. You keep trying to add more clarity, more understanding, more answers. But your cup is already overflowing. You don't need more, you need to empty it." That's the wisdom of turning inward. It's the wisdom of subtracting, not adding. So how do we actually do it? How do we return to our center when the world is loud and the mind is louder? You don't need a cave. You don't need perfect peace. You just need presence. Here's how. Step 1, breathe with awareness. Before checking your phone, before speaking, pause, take a full, conscious breath. Feel it fill your body. Feel it leave, just that. Already you're home. Step 2, watch, don't judge. When a thought comes, don't label it good or bad. Just let it rise. Let it fall like clouds passing through the sky. Step 3, ask one powerful question. Is this pulling me away from myself or returning me to myself? That one question can change everything. The Buddha didn't teach you to become perfect. He taught you how to see clearly. And when you see clearly, not through the lens of fear or ego, you naturally return to your center. And from that center, decisions become easier. You stop over-explaining, you stop over-giving, you stop overthinking. Because you know who you are. And from that knowing, you live. Let's be honest, we're all just trying to find our way, but most of us are doing it while sprinting in circles. We think we're lost, but we've just wandered too far from the stillness within. So today, just for today, don't try to fix everything. Don't try to understand everyone. Just come back to your breath, to your body, to your being. You don't need a new version of yourself. You just need to return to the one you were before the world told you who to be, because that version was never lost. It was just waiting for you. Here now, in this breath, let me ask you something quietly but honestly. What holds your life together when everything falls apart? It's not motivation, it's not emotion, it's not inspiration, it's discipline, but not the cold, rigid kind we were taught. Not punishment, not restriction. I'm speaking about something sacred, a divine discipline that anchors your soul to its purpose. Because in Buddhism, discipline isn't suppression, it's alignment. It's the quiet architecture of a meaningful life, built brick by brick, not in the spotlight, but in silence. Let's return to nature. A bamboo tree grows underground for up to 5 years, forming an intricate root system. You see nothing, but one day, seemingly overnight, it shoots up over 90 feet in just weeks. That's discipline. It's the quiet work done when no one is watching. The early mornings, the meditations you show up for, the rituals you keep, the distractions you say no to. No applause, no instant reward, but later. An inner strength so tall it touches the sky. In Zen monasteries, discipline begins before dawn, before the sun rises. The bell rings, one breath, one robe, one walk, one bowl of rice. Every step deliberate, every action mindful, every repetition sacred. You might think, isn't that boring, mechanical? No, it's liberating, because in repetition they meet themselves. Not once, but over and over again. They don't meditate because they feel like it. They meditate because they said they would. Discipline is how Buddhists water the seeds of clarity, one silent act at a time. Modern life teaches us to chase dopamine. Scrolls, likes, praise, sugar, distraction. But Buddhism teaches us to choose ritual over impulse. You don't wait until you're inspired to take care of your mind. You don't wait until you're overwhelmed to return to stillness. You build the habit now. So when the storm comes, your roots hold. Let's say this together. I do not rely on motivation. I rely on my devotion. A young monk once approached his teacher. "Master," he said, "I've meditated for 30 days straight and nothing has changed." The teacher replied, "Then meditate for 30 more, without needing change." Discipline is not about getting results. It's about becoming someone worthy of receiving them. You meditate not to become a master, but to master yourself. You journal not to impress, but to understand your inner world. You wake early, not because the world demands it, but because your soul whispers that it's time to begin again. Because they tie discipline to emotion, and emotion changes fast. One day you feel hopeful, the next anxious. One day energized, the next tired, but discipline doesn't ask, "Do you feel like it today?" It simply says, "I'll see you at the cushion anyway." And that's when life starts to shift, because your consistency becomes your confidence. Your rituals become your refuge. Your inner structure becomes your strength. Want to live with purpose even in chaos? Start here. Step 1, choose one ritual that aligns with your highest self. Don't choose what's trendy, choose what's true. Maybe it's morning breathwork. Maybe it's a tea ceremony at 5 a.m. Maybe it's 5 minutes of mindful walking at night. Small is sacred. Step 2, anchor it to something you already do. Stack it. Attach it to a habit that already exists, right after brushing your teeth, right before your first sip of coffee, right after work ends. Let it become part of you. Step 3, protect it like it's prayer. Don't let emotion, distraction, or schedule interrupt it. Guard it as if your life depends on it, because your peace does. Step 4, reflect on how you feel after. Let your discipline become your teacher. How do you feel after doing it, even when you didn't want to? That feeling is your soul stretching. Some people confuse discipline with force, but forcing is fear-based. It says, if I don't do this, I'll fail. Discipline is love-based. It says, I do this because I honor who I'm becoming. You don't have to scream at yourself to become better. You just need to whisper, I'm here again, let's begin. The path of the Buddha was not walked in leaps. It was walked in silent, sacred, consistent steps. Think of your life like a temple. Every small habit, every quiet morning, every silent sit, every kind choice is a brick. You may not see it now, but one day you'll look back and stand in awe of the temple you've built. A temple of peace, a structure of stillness, a sanctuary of strength, and no one else may see how it was made, but you will know. You'll know the effort, the tears, the early mornings, the moments you showed up just because. That's the reward of divine discipline. So let me ask you, what would your life feel like if your actions were sacred, if your rituals were non-negotiable, if you stopped waiting for motivation and started living from devotion? Remember this, you don't rise when you feel like it. You rise when you remember who you're becoming, and each quiet action is one more step toward that person. So build the structure now, even when no one sees, especially when no one sees. Because that unseen effort, that's what makes you unshakable. You are not here to fix everyone. You are not a dumping ground for other people's chaos. You are not unkind because you protect your peace. In fact, you are deeply compassionate. Because in Buddhism, compassion does not mean overextending. It means knowing when to hold space and when to step back. It means knowing this sacred truth. Protecting your energy is an act of love, not just for you but for the world. Most people hear the word boundary and think of isolation. Walls, rejection, separation. But in Buddhism, a boundary is not built out of fear. It's built out of clarity. You don't shut people out. You simply define where you end and where someone else begins. It's not selfish, it's skillful. Because when your energy is scattered, you can't offer anything true to anyone. When your heart is drained, even your kindness turns into resentment. But when you create space to breathe, reflect, recharge, you return to others with genuine presence. A monk once walked through a village, blessing everyone he passed. One day, a bitter traveler shouted at him, accusing him of being fake, useless, naive. The monk said nothing. He smiled, bowed gently, and kept walking. The traveler ran after him. Why don't you defend yourself? I just insulted you. The monk turned calmly and replied, if someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does it belong? That's the teaching. Not all energy is meant to be received. Not all emotions need to be absorbed. Not all people deserve your attention. Let's be honest. Toxic people don't always show up with evil intentions. They often wear familiar faces. A family member, a childhood friend, a coworker you once trusted, but the effect is always the same. You leave the interaction feeling drained, unclear, like you betrayed yourself by staying too long or saying too much. Here's how to tell if a relationship is toxic. 1, you feel smaller around them. You shrink. You withhold your truth. You doubt your light. 2, they ignore your boundaries or make you feel guilty for having them. 3, the relationship is one-sided. They take, vent, complain, but rarely offer real care or presence. For you feel anxious before or after seeing them. Your nervous system is on alert, not your intuition. That's data. And here's the truth many avoid. You don't owe anyone unlimited access to you. We're conditioned to believe that if you're spiritual, you must be endlessly available, always forgiving, always patient, always open. But that's a misunderstanding. The Buddha never taught self-sacrifice at the cost of sanity. He taught discernment, the ability to see clearly. He taught that you cannot carry someone else's suffering if it drowns your own peace. So sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is step away, not in anger, but in loving detachment, because compassion without boundaries turns into self-abandonment. There's a beautiful analogy in Buddhist storytelling. A man clings to a rope out of fear of falling, but the rope is old and frayed. It cuts into his hand, it bleeds, still he holds on tighter, until finally he lets go. And only then does he see. He was just a few feet above the ground all along. His pain didn't come from the fall, it came from the clinging, just like us. We often bleed from holding on to relationships that were meant to be released long ago. Letting go doesn't mean you failed. It means you're wise enough to know what cannot be saved, and brave enough to choose peace anyway. You don't always need to explain yourself. You don't need dramatic goodbyes or angry messages. You can simply stop dancing in someone else's storm. Here's a 4-step practice from Buddhist psychology on how to set boundaries with love and clarity. 1. Observe how you feel after being around someone. Do you feel grounded or disturbed? 2. Set silent boundaries. You don't have to justify your peace. Distance is a decision, not a debate. 3. Let silence become your sanctuary. Don't fill it with guilt or doubt. Fill it with breath, with practice, with loving self-presence. 4. Bless their path and release them, even if they don't understand. You can let go with compassion, not contempt, because your peace matters more than their opinion. Imagine a great bodhi tree. Silent, still, powerful. Some will rest in its shade, others will walk past it, some may even throw stones at it, but the tree remains rooted. It doesn't follow people, trying to explain why it grows the way it does. It just stands. You are that tree. Let people misunderstand you. Let them mislabel your silence. Let them think what they will. Because in the end, you are not here to be liked by everyone. You are here to live in truth. Think of your energy like a candle flame. Some people will warm their hands with it. Others will try to blow it out. Your job isn't to please everyone. Your job is to protect the flame, because from that flame, you light lamps for others. You serve, you love, you give, but never let your light go out. In the name of proving you're a good person. True goodness shines, not from burnout but from boundaries. Let's pause here. Close your eyes for a moment. Ask yourself, who or what is draining me right now? What am I afraid to let go of? And what would my life feel like if I finally did? Listen. Let the answer rise in silence, and when it does, honor it, because sometimes the most powerful way to love others is to stop letting them hurt you, and the most sacred way to love yourself is to finally say, "No more, I choose peace." If you want to know who you're becoming, don't look at your dreams. Look at your days, not your goals, not your intentions, not your vision board, but what you actually do. Every morning, every evening, every silent hour when no one's watching. That's your identity. In Buddhism, we do not ask, "Who do I want to become?" We ask, "What do I practice?" Because what you practice, you become. Karma is often misunderstood in the West. It's not about cosmic revenge. It's not do bad things get punished. In its truest sense, karma means action, but more precisely, it means habitual action. Every time you speak kindly, you're planting a seed. Every time you react with anger, you're watering that seed. Over time, these repeated actions build pathways in your mind. They become tendencies, then patterns, then your personality. That's karma, not mystical, just mathematical. One of the Buddha's most profound insights is this: there is no permanent self. There is only a collection of tendencies held together by clinging. In other words, You are not your name, your thoughts, or your past. You are your habits. And the good news, habits can change. You can rewrite karma. You can rewire patterns. You can literally rebirth yourself. Not in the next life, but in this one, right now. The Buddha once taught that when pain comes, it's like being struck by an arrow, but then we shoot a second arrow. One of self-pity, blame, avoidance, or shame. The first arrow is life. The second arrow is habit. And that second one is optional. Every time you complain instead of accept, second arrow. Every time you numb instead of feel, second arrow. Every time you procrastinate instead of act, second arrow. Want to change your identity? Stop firing the second arrow. Start showing up differently. You don't transform your life overnight. You become different by choosing differently, consistently. Small habits are sacred rituals, not because they're flashy, but because they build your foundation. And in Buddhism, the foundation matters more than the form. You don't need to meditate for an hour, but you need to do it every day. You don't need to eat perfectly, but you need to eat consciously. You don't need to do more. You need to do what matters again and again. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. That's the Zen way. Because the extraordinary is hidden in the most ordinary things. Done with full attention. Make tea, bow, clean, sit, walk, breathe. These are not chores, they're choices, they're declarations. I live with care, I move with presence, I train in peace. And eventually, that's who you become. Modern neuroscience supports what the Buddha said 2,500 years ago. Whatever the mind frequently thinks upon, that it becomes. In brain science, this is called neuroplasticity. The ability of your brain to rewire itself based on repetition. Think anxious thoughts often. You strengthen anxiety circuits. Practice gratitude regularly. You wire your brain for joy. This is not magic, it's biology, but biology shaped by conscious choice. So instead of asking, why am I like this? Ask, what am I reinforcing every day? Let's go deeper. Look at today. What did you reach for this morning? Phone or breath? How did you start your day? With silence or with stress? What did you feed your mind? Drama or dharma? What are you practicing? And even more, who are you becoming because of it? Remember, you don't rise to your highest self by accident. You ritualize your way there. Let's create clarity. Take 5 minutes at the end of your day. Sit in stillness. Ask yourself, what did I repeat today? Did my habits serve my peace or my pain? Where did I choose distraction over discipline? Where did I return to my center? Write it down. No shame, just awareness. Because awareness is the beginning of transformation. You can't change what you don't see, and you won't sustain what you don't track. Let's be very clear. You don't become disciplined by accident. You become disciplined through devotion. A devotion to who you could be. If you stopped waiting for inspiration, a devotion to your future self, who will look back and say, thank you for showing up, even when I didn't feel like it. So start small. 1 cup of tea in silence. 1 breath before you react. 1 line of journaling each night. 1 conscious meal without your phone. These are not rules. They are acts of love. Love for who you're becoming. Let's return to the truth. You are what you repeatedly do. Your habits shape your destiny. Your daily actions are your spiritual path. No guru can do it for you. No shortcut will carry you across the storm. But you, in your sacred repetitions, will rise, so stop waiting, start practicing. Pick 1 habit today. Something small, something real. And repeat it with love. Because that's how mountains are moved. That's how identities are rewritten. That's how a scattered soul becomes whole again. Not with force, but with small, sacred, steady steps. Done with devotion. You want transformation. Don't look for a breakthrough, look for a habit. Then repeat it until it rewrites your life. Because peace is not an event, it's a practice. In the middle of the storm, what rises from within you? Panic, anger, defensiveness, or presence? Because life will always test you, but what you do when things fall apart, that's your real practice. And here's the ancient teaching. Do not learn to react, learn to respond. Between every stimulus and every response, there is a space. In that space is your power. Most people live without ever seeing that space. A word offends them, right arrow they shout. A plan fails, right arrow they spiral. A delay happens, right arrow they lose control. That's not strength, that's reactivity. But the mindful person breathes, they see the space. They pause, they respond with intention, not impulse. That's not avoidance, that's mastery. A Zen master sat calmly in a temple when a furious warrior barged in and shouted, "Teach me peace, old man, now." The master didn't flinch. He smiled gently and said, "Sit, be still. Listen to the birds." The warrior shouted louder, "Are you deaf? I said teach me." The master finally looked at him and whispered, "If you cannot hear the birds, how will you ever hear the silence inside you?" The warrior paused. For the first time in his life, that's mindfulness, not reacting to noise outside or inside, but listening beyond it. In Buddhist metaphors, the mindful person is like bamboo, strong yet flexible, rooted yet able to bend. When the storm comes, the bamboo doesn't resist with rigidity, it yields. So many people try to win the chaos, to control, overpower, dominate it, but chaos is not conquered. It is moved through like a river. The river does not argue with the rock, it flows around it. Mindfulness is the art of flow. You don't have to get rid of chaos. You only need to stop drowning in it. In every tradition of Buddhist practice, the breath is the first anchor. Why? Because the breath is always here. It's now, it's real. It's the one tool you can never lose. Unless you forget it, so next time someone disrespects you, a plan fails, veer spikes, don't speak, don't scroll, don't strike. Breathe, one full inhale, one slow exhale, and in that breath, you return to yourself. Not your thoughts, not your anger, but your awareness. Because it is not your emotions that destroy peace. It is your unconscious reaction to them. Let's be honest. You will feel anger, you will feel fear, you will feel overwhelmed. The goal isn't to erase emotion. It's to meet it with consciousness. Instead of, why is this happening to me? Try, what is this teaching me? Instead of, I must fix this now. Try, can I sit with this just for one breath? The mind, when left unchecked, reacts like dry grass to flame. But the mind, when trained, becomes fireproof. Science supports this truth too. Your brain is wired for quick reactions. It evolved that way for survival, but the prefrontal cortex, the higher brain, gives you the ability to pause, to reflect, to respond. Every time you take a breath, instead of lashing out, you're literally rewiring your brain. That's neuroplasticity. That's Dharma meeting neuroscience. That's evolution, not just biological but spiritual. The Buddha once said, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." But here's the deeper layer. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who observes your thoughts. Mindfulness is that observation. When you learn to watch the wave rise, without jumping into it, you unlock peace the world cannot touch, because now, you are no longer a puppet to emotions. You are the sky, vast, silent, witnessing, and clouds, they come, they go. But the sky remains, so does your awareness. Here's a powerful 4-step practice. To apply in the heat of any storm: 1. Stop, interrupt the cycle, create that space. 2. Breathe, anchor into the body, let the breath soften the reaction. 3. Watch, name the emotion. Anger is here. Don't become it, just notice. 4. Choose, ask, what response serves my peace right now? Then act from presence. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. Most people live like they owe the world a reaction, but you don't. You don't have to argue with the troll, defend yourself to ignorance, prove your worth in chaos. Your silence may be misunderstood. Let it be. Your stillness may be mocked. Let it be. Because when you stop reacting to noise, you start creating presence. And presence is power the ego can never fake. Ever notice how a calm person shifts the whole room? They don't speak louder. They don't command attention, they just are, and people feel it. That can be you. The person who doesn't flinch when the world shakes. The person who listens instead of lashes. The person who waits until wisdom, not ego, speaks. That's not spiritual theory, that's practiced mindfulness. That's your power. Let's breathe together right now. Inhale. Exhale. Ask yourself, what triggers me most often? Where do I react instead of respond? What would it feel like to just pause, practice that, not once, every day, until presence becomes your default, and peace becomes your nature, because chaos will come again. But this time, you'll meet it differently, not with fear, not with panic, but with presence, and that changes everything. You don't need to control the world. You only need to control one thing, how you respond to it. And in that choice, you reclaim your freedom. You don't need more information. You need more stillness. Zen Buddhism Wisdom. In a world that never stops scrolling, pausing is an act of rebellion. Silence is subversive. Stillness, revolutionary. But let's be honest. You don't need to be told the internet is noisy. You feel it. That itch to check notifications. The dopamine spike of likes. The anxiety when your phone is missing for 10 seconds. The endless tabs, none of which are bringing peace. This is not freedom. This is addiction disguised as connection. The Buddha taught that suffering comes from clinging. In the digital age, we cling to screens. We fear missing out. We chase approval through algorithms. We scroll for answers we already carry within. But here's the paradox. The more connected you are digitally, the more disconnected you become spiritually. You check your phone first thing in the morning, before your breath, before your intention, before your awareness. You've taught your mind. The world outside matters more than the world within. And so the inner voice dims, the clarity fades, the anxiety rises. This isn't about judgment, it's about awakening. A student once came to a Zen master, eager to learn everything at once. The master poured him tea and kept pouring until the cup overflowed. The student shouted, "Stop it spilling." The master smiled. "Exactly, your mind is the same. How can I give you anything when it's already too full?" That is your feed. That is your inbox. That is your mind when overloaded by distraction. You are not empty enough to receive anything real. Science confirms what monks have known for centuries. The average person checks their phone over 150 times a day. Most spend 7+ hours online daily. Attention span, shorter than a goldfish's. Every ping, notification, scroll. It splits your focus. It floods your nervous system. It trains your brain to live in reaction, not reflection. This is samsara digitally upgraded. An endless loop of craving, distraction, emptiness. And like any samsara, it must be seen clearly to be broken. You think you're just checking emails, but really, you're avoiding a feeling. You're numbing uncertainty. You're chasing dopamine. Each scroll becomes a small escape. But every escape has a cost. Your presence. And when you trade presence for performance, peace slips away unnoticed. The more you plug into the noise, the less you hear your own knowing. This is not a guilt trip. It's a call to awareness, to realize your energy is sacred. And where attention goes, life flows. Digital minimalism isn't anti-tech, it's pro-intention. It asks, is this tool using me or am I using it? Is this helping me grow or just keeping me numb? Do I need this app Or do I need a moment of silence? The Buddha renounced his palace, not because luxury is evil, but because it clouded his clarity. You don't need to go live in a cave, but you might need to log out. Just long enough to log back into yourself. Let's not be abstract. Here is how you practice digital minimalism. As a form of mindfulness, Step 1. Audit your attention. Track how you use your devices for 24 hours. Notice patterns. Do you scroll when lonely, bored, triggered? Step 2. Create sacred boundaries. No screens for the first and last 30 minutes of your day. Phone lives outside the bedroom. Step 3. Replace, don't just remove. Silence replaced by meditation. Scrolls replaced by walking. Texts replaced by journaling. Step 4. Weekly digital Sabbath. Pick one day per week. No social media, no notifications. Let boredom arise and teach you what you've been avoiding. This is not restriction. This is returning to breath, to presence, to self. A practitioner I know once did a full day of digital silence. No phone, no laptop, no music, no podcasts, no screens, just her and her breath. She journaled, she sat, she walked slowly, she cooked mindfully. She said afterward, "I didn't realize how loud I had become inside until the noise stopped." Sometimes silence is not the absence of sound. It's the return of meaning. Modern life loves multitasking, but Zen teaches one mindfulness. When drinking tea, just drink tea. When walking, just walk. When working, just work. Try this. Close all tabs, turn off all notifications, set a timer for 20 minutes. Now do just one thing. Feel your mind focus. Feel your energy deepen. Feel yourself return. This is not productivity. This is presence. Every time you reach for your phone, ask, is this feeding my peace or my distraction? If it's peace, welcome it. If it's distraction, bless it. And let it pass like a cloud. You don't have to delete everything. You just have to see everything clearly and choose from awareness. Because in the end, your attention is your life. Let's breathe together. Inhale, exhale. Now look at the screen you're holding. And remember, this is not your master. It's a tool. Use it with intention or put it down with compassion. But don't let it steal the silence you were born to inhabit. Because when the scrolling stops, the true self begins to speak, and that voice, quiet, ancient, true, is your greatest teacher. The greatest download you can ever receive is not from the cloud, but from your inner stillness. Turn down the noise. Log out, reclaim your presence. This is the real connection. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness behind them. Zen Buddhism Wisdom. The mind loves certainty. The heart craves control. But life offers neither. And so you worry, you overthink. You tighten your grip, hoping control will protect you. But all it does is imprison you. Overthinking is not intelligence. It's insecurity wearing a smart disguise. You plan the conversation 10 different ways. You rehearse how to respond if things go wrong. You analyze yesterday. You fear tomorrow. You loop again and again. Why? Because your mind is trying to find peace in control. But here's the Buddhist truth. Peace isn't found in control. Peace is found in surrender. In Buddhism, samsara is the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. But there's a micro samsara too, your thoughts. They are born. They grow. They dominate your energy, then fade, only to rise again. Overthinking is mental rebirth on repeat. Each thought births fear. Each fear births a scenario. Each scenario births more stress, until you're drowning in a sea of what if. A student once said to a monk, "I feel lost in thought." The monk replied, "That's because you're standing in a river and trying to hold on to every leaf that floats by. Thoughts are not the enemy, but clinging to them is. Imagine trying to catch every leaf in a flowing stream. Exhausting, right? Now imagine just sitting by the stream, watching, letting go. That's the essence of surrender. The Buddha taught that tanha, craving, is the root of suffering. One of the most insidious cravings, the craving for a specific result. You meditate to feel peace, but feel restless. You love someone expecting them to love back. You work hard expecting recognition. And when the result doesn't match the plan, you suffer. But here's the shift. Surrender is not giving up. It's giving over control to the present moment. In Japan, a farmer planted bamboo seeds. For a year, nothing. Year 2, nothing. Year 3, still nothing. Villagers laughed. He kept watering. Then, in the 5th year, a tiny shoot broke the surface. And in 6 weeks, it grew over 80 feet tall. Why? Because for 5 years it had been growing underground, building roots unseen. Surrender is like that. You show up, you water. You trust the unseen growth. Let go of the outcome. Focus on the roots. In Buddhism, there's a term, virya, energy, diligence, but it's not effort tied to ego, it's sacred effort. It means, I will give my full presence to this moment, without needing to control what comes next. This is not laziness. This is devotion without clinging. Try this today. Meditate not to feel better, but to be here. Work not to impress, but to express your truth. Love not to be loved back, but because you are love itself. Here's how you know. You delay action until the plan feels perfect. You feel discouraged by slow results. You obsess over others' opinions of your work. You micromanage or stress over what's out of your hands. You feel you failed when expectations aren't met. All of this creates internal chaos. But awareness softens it. Ask, am I acting from presence or from a desire to control? When you truly surrender, you act but don't obsess. You care but don't cling. You try but you're not tense. You plan but hold the plan lightly. You don't stop working. You just stop overowning the result. You plant the seed and trust the seasons. And when peace becomes the goal, not perfection, suddenly the pressure lifts. Here's a small but powerful habit. Whenever you feel overwhelmed by what if or not enough thoughts, do this. Pause, put your hand on your heart, inhale deeply, say softly, I surrender the outcome. Exhale and return to now. Repeat as often as needed. This small ritual can break the cycle of overthinking and reconnect you to trust. Overthinking keeps you in the past. Attachment pulls you to the future, but life only lives in one place, now. The monk doesn't obsess over how peaceful his meditation will be. He simply sits, breathes, and trusts that presence is enough. You can do the same. Let go of the chase, return to the breath, act from presence, then release. Let's breathe together. Inhale, exhale. Now ask, what am I trying to control right now? What result am I clinging to? Can I trust that what's meant for me will not pass me? Feel the tension in your body. Let it melt. Remember, letting go is not weakness. It is the highest form of wisdom. The mind wants control. The soul wants freedom. Choose wisely. You don't have to fix everything. You only have to flow with life. Let go, show up, breathe. Because in surrender, everything begins to fall into place. The peace you are looking for is not in the next achievement, not in the next relationship, not in the next validation. It's in this breath, this stillness, this moment. You've walked through many teachings in this journey. The art of silence, the power of solitude, the grace of surrender, the discipline of daily habits, the courage to let go, and the wisdom to return inward. But in truth, you've only been returning to one place all along, yourself. Because everything you seek, peace, clarity, love, meaning, already exists within you. It was never missing, only buried beneath noise, distraction, fear, and expectations. Now, in this final moment, allow me to remind you of one thing. You are not broken. You are simply learning to live from your center again. Modern culture tells you to hustle, shout, prove, compete. But Zen teaches a deeper truth. Power is not in reaction, but in presence. Not in control, but in clarity. Not in noise, but in knowing. The monk walking barefoot in silence. The woman meditating at dawn. The elder who listens more than she speaks. These are not weak people. These are masters of energy. Warriors of stillness. Rebels of the inner revolution. You can be one too. Life will continue to test you. There will be storms, people will misunderstand you, screens will distract, emotions will rise. But now you hold something most never even search for, the awareness to choose your response, the strength to protect your peace, the discipline to live with intention, and the wisdom to return inward when the world pulls you outward. Let's redefine success. It's not the number in your bank account. It's not the praise others give you. It's not being perfect, popular, or productive. Real success is this: waking up without anxiety, sitting in silence without needing distraction, being present in conversations, breathing deeply even when life gets hard, protecting your joy like it's sacred, choosing peace over drama, trusting the flow of life. If you have these, you are already wealthy beyond measure. Don't let this video be just inspiration. Let it become a way of life, a ritual, a return. Create sacred space in your day, 10 minutes of stillness in the morning, one mindful breath before every reply, a moment of silence before sleep. These are not just habits. They are how you reclaim your soul. What am I chasing outside that I've abandoned inside? Where am I leaking my energy when I could be nurturing my clarity? Who am I becoming when no one is watching? Let these questions guide your days. Let silence answer them. Let your presence become your greatest offering to this world. You don't need to escape to a monastery. Your breath is your meditation hall. Your awareness is your altar. Your silence is your prayer. Your peace is your enlightenment. Wherever you are, this moment can become sacred. This mind can become free. This life can become still, soft, awake. If no one has told you today, you are enough. You are worthy of peace. You are not too late. You are not too broken. You are on the path, and the path is not somewhere outside. It has always been inward. So go gently, go quietly, but go all in, because your inner peace, calm, radiant, and rooted, is your true power. And when the world tries to shake you, may your silence speak louder than words. Be still, be aware, be free.